Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning, and it was fabulous listening to Viv and the story of the work that she's done at Harrods. I'm going to talk about transforming culture through disruption and change. Sounds like a big subject. There were quite a lot of parallels between some of the work that Viv had done at Harrods and the work that we'd done at Santander as well. So I thought that was quite interesting. Hopefully I'm not going to be too saying the same thing, but it's just another example of companies that are dealing with how do you engage with your employees, how do you motivate employees in a time that is full of change. I want to talk about the journey that we've gone on at Santander in transforming our culture over the last 4 to 5 years. And I think there's never been a more important time to be talking about culture and for that to be front and centre of boardroom conversations, discussions at an executive level. And certainly financial services is going through unprecedented change, and it has been for the last few years. There's a comment that Justin Trudeau made that really resonated with me, which is that change has never been this fast, and yet it will never be this slow again. And you know, when you think, gosh, we're so busy, everything's changing, we're going through a period of enormous change, it kind of then seems to speed up a little bit, and you never get to the end of making sure that you're evolving the culture. If I just start off looking at Santander and just positioning a little bit about what our organisation is about. We have a purpose to help people and businesses prosper. And I want to talk to you about the actions that we have taken to help land that purpose with our colleagues and to bring it to life. We did that by developing or by launching a programme called the Santander Way, and we created 3 values: simple, personal and fair. And they were the values that we started off using them internally with colleagues, and then ultimately we launched them externally out to our customers as well. And it was around this time when we had simple, personal and fair as our values within Santander UK that I was asked to help support the Santander Way programme. So what I want to talk to you about this morning is just to draw out some of the highlights over the last few years of what we have done to establish our culture and then to keep on evolving and changing it as the business has changed and as challenges in our own organisation and in financial services in general have occurred. So we're going to start off at the beginning. I said before that we had the launch of our values, simple, personal and fair. And when we launched the values, everyone responded very well to them because they were very clear and they were easy to understand. But actually, I've gone on a little. Oh, that's fine, sorry. But actually, they were less easy to action. So although you can say we want to be simple, personal and fair, the real challenge is then, okay, well, how are we going to do that? And our CEO was very aware of the fact that we had set this direction of wanting to be simple, personal and fair, but we hadn't actually explained to people how we wanted them to do it. And we needed to be specific about the culture that we wanted to create. Otherwise, the risk was that everyone was going to go off and have their own version of what simple, personal and fair meant, and to think about what behaviours might be required to deliver on simple, personal and fair and go off in different directions. Now at the time, so I'm going back to kind of 2015, defining behaviours was very fashionable. Lots of organisations were defining behaviours and rolling them out across their organisations. And at the time, as I got involved in the project, I read quite a lot of books and articles, and there were lots of consultancies offering to come in and help define the behaviours for us. But we decided to do it a different way, and it was very much led by our CEO. He wanted to go out and talk to people about what the behaviours were that employees felt were important. A bit like when Viv was talking about Harrods, Santander has a very long history. So we have got employees who've worked for Abbey National, Alliance and Leicester, Bradford and Bingley, employees who joined after Santander had acquired those businesses. And we had an employee group, community, who were hugely passionate about the brands that they worked for. So his view was, how do we really listen to those colleagues rather than going out and telling them how to behave, because they probably know better than anyone. And so we embarked on a series of roadshows across the country. We ended up actually speaking and inviting over 2,000 employees to these roadshows. And Nathan would stand at the roadshows, and he would ask people 3 questions, and they would work together in groups to come up with their response to those questions. The first question he asked was, in a word, they had to answer, what does it feel like to work here right now? Secondly, how do you want it to feel? And thirdly, what behaviour is needed to make that change happen? So there were those 3 questions, and he was on listening mode. So as the groups were discussing those questions, we kept the answers very simple in terms of these one-word answers, but he was listening to what they were saying. And at the end of each group, we would take this all this input and put it all together so that at the end of the sessions, we had got a good long list, and it was a very long list, of all of the different inputs and subjects that colleagues were discussing. And we then distilled this down to a sort of long list of key themes that were coming out. But actually, we wanted to dig a bit deeper on some of the themes that were emerging. And so we went out again and we did another series of roadshows, this time including other members of the executive committee, to go out and really engage with our colleagues across the country, and to dig a bit deeper into those subjects that had come up in the long list. At the same time, we launched an online tool where we put out what these key themes, these behaviour themes were, and asked colleagues who hadn't been to the roadshows to comment on them and to identify which ones they thought were priorities, and to comment on the responses that other colleagues were making. Now, all of this meant that actually every single employee in the whole company was able to get involved in the creation of the behaviours. So this was a huge undertaking, and it was a real two-way conversation between colleagues in the business and ultimately our CEO. So at the end of this, you can imagine we had a lot of data, had a lot of information. So this was a kind of going and sitting with a sort of towel over your head moment and distilling all of this down. And that was the work that me and my team undertook. It wasn't easy. But actually, by talking about the behaviours in such depth, some key themes really began to come through to us. What we found was that our people had been really, really honest. They were very open to talking about what was good and what could be improved in the organisation, but also they were just so positive that somebody had come to ask them, that their opinion mattered and that something was going to be done as a response to that. So we ended up with 9 behaviours, and at the time I remember we had identified a sort of a framework. You can see them over there on the other side of the screen. At the time, everyone was saying, oh, you need to have 5 or 6, otherwise nobody will ever remember them. But actually, they were the 9 that our employees had said were important to them. So our view was actually, if they are the top priorities for our colleagues, then actually it's not okay for us to just kind of take some away. So it might be a long list, but actually they are the things that are important to our colleagues. The other thing that we did, and this might seem a sort of minor point, but at the time, lots of organisations had got values of things like respect or collaborate or passion, and they were kind of one-word values or one-word behaviours. And what we wanted to do was to keep some of the spirit or a lot of the spirit, of our colleagues in those behaviours. So we made them all 2 words, so that you got a little bit of the sentiment that was behind them, not just the kind of headline word. And so, sorry, let me just pop back here for a moment so I don't lose my train of thought. So we were, hopefully, and this certainly is how they landed with our colleagues, they felt less corporate and more personal to Santander. When we launched the behaviours, which if I come onto my next slide in here, so we've got the creation of the behaviours. When we launched them, we were very careful about the way that we did that, very thoughtful. So there were no mugs, no mouse mats, nothing that was a kind of symbolism of we've gone away and developed some behaviours and now we're just going to launch them with some merchandise. It was really important as part of our launch process that they felt authentic right from the start. So we did do communications, of course, about them, but we tried to stay away from things that was too much symbolism. We developed the materials to share with colleagues what the behaviours meant using all the language that they had used with us. So we were able to articulate this is what the behaviours are and this is what they're not. We also made sure in the launch, because we'd had this voice coming up from our colleagues to create them, that we had very much a kind of leader-led communication process. And what I mean by that is we have our 9 behaviours, and for the next 9 months we took one behaviour each month and really focused on it. And we would have a member of our executive committee who felt particularly strongly about that particular behaviour. It was one that was important to them. They would share their own story about why that behaviour meant a lot to them. And they would then make a personal commitment of something they were going to do differently with regard to that behaviour. And then what we did was we developed some packs that went right across the business. So we asked every team in the business to talk and think about that behaviour and then to make a commitment of something they were going to change. So you had the leader demonstrating a little bit of humility around, yeah, I'm not perfect and I'm going to change, and then asking everybody in the business to do the same thing. So it was kind of top to bottom. And that worked really well. It got an energy in the business. And I know Viv talked a lot about the personal stories, but actually if you're engaging with colleagues from the bottom up, then you start to get those stories. People were very happy in the contact centres, in our branches, to share what their commitments were and to share how they were making a difference. One of the things that happened probably a little bit unexpectedly, although it probably shouldn't have been, is that the behaviours very quickly got adopted into normal conversation in the organisation. I think because colleagues had got so involved in creating them. So individuals would talk about, if I just go back on there, you would hear people saying, oh, you know, well done for really speaking up in that meeting, or you did a great job at talking straight in that situation, and actually using the language. And I think that's because we were playing back the language that colleagues had used with us when we were creating the behaviours in the first place. So that worked really well, and for us it meant that we very quickly had the behaviours established in the normal conversation of the business, in the sort of heartbeat of the organisation. That said, that's kind of talking about the launch of the behaviours. I think that one of the things that was clear to us is, having invested all this time in creating the behaviours, we needed to make sure that they were really embedded in the organisation and in our culture. So it's all very well to have the behaviours, you know, on the supermarket trolley as you go around, but if actually they don't get reinforced in those moments that matter, then the whole thing unravels very quickly and you can get very cynical about the behaviours and what they mean. So let me just explain what I mean by that. For us, I wanted to make this quite practical in the way that I was talking to you this morning. So having created the behaviours, we then had a committee that was led by our CEO, and it would meet regularly. It was called the Santander Way Committee, and it was about how do we make sure that we are keeping momentum going on our cultural journey and that the behaviours are being embedded across the organisation. And we did that by looking at our whole employee life cycle and reviewing how can we make sure that the behaviours are introduced and are part of all of the different steps around that journey. So first of all, we updated our recruitment materials, our recruitment process, so that when we're assessing people to come and join the organisation, we have got behaviour-based questions as part of that selection criteria. A kind of an obvious one is obviously make sure you're talking about those behaviours as part of any induction programme so that people know what's important when the first day that they start. We also changed our performance management process so that we had 50% of performance based on what you delivered and 50% on how you delivered it, which was based on the behaviours. And then we also developed quite a lot of new materials for development and learning, so helping people to understand how to have conversations about behaviours. One of the things that we found quite early on is that actually in terms of giving feedback around performance, people were quite comfortable or more comfortable to talk about positive behaviour, but it was actually more difficult to talk about poorer behaviours or where somebody maybe needed to focus a little bit more on one behaviour. And we ran a development programme, sorry, not a development programme, a training exercise. It was about a year after the behaviours had been launched, and we rolled it out to all the line managers in the business. And part of this programme, it felt very, very different. They came along to a day where actually we had some actors planted in amongst the tables of the sort of seminar workshop. And those actors behaved badly. So they demonstrated, not listening, sitting there on their phones during presentations, if in group discussions, being very dismissive, not being passionate at all about the organisation. And actually we then, without going into all of the detail of it, because I'll go on for too long, but those actors highlighted behaviours that we said we didn't want to see, and then the training that followed was helping line managers in how to deal with that type of behaviour. It felt really different for our colleagues and it was really impactful, and it was very practical because they had got the actor right there that they could then sort of review what would the techniques be for how you would deal with a behaviour that wasn't in line with what we're hoping our line managers would we would want all colleagues to demonstrate. One of the other things that we did from an embedding perspective is we changed our recognition scheme. So we actually launched a new recognition scheme that was online. It was linked to the behaviours, and it allowed everybody in the organisation, so it was peer-to-peer, any colleague could thank another colleague linked to a behaviour. Some of them had a small monetary reward attached to it, but actually simply thank you, which was just sending a message to somebody, was by far the most popular. And this really opened up a whole new way of being able to talk about the behaviours colleague to colleague, and it was a really nice way of just allowing people to say thank you to each other. So it was kind of that behavioural nudge that created a bit of a new social norm, that it's okay to share feedback. And then the final piece in this employee life cycle is obviously making sure that you're thinking about the behaviours when you're assessing talent and deciding how you're going to develop your succession plans. So I think my message on this in terms of cultural change is when you're launching something like new behaviours that you hope are going to change your culture, you've got to really mean it. And that's the hardest part to get right. And how do you know if you're getting it right? I'm not saying that at Santander we've got everything perfect, but you do need to keep on checking what's working and what's not working. And we did that by launching a culture survey, which we've run for the last 4 years. We have a global engagement survey that's run across the whole group, but we wanted to ask some specific questions about the behaviours in the UK, and we used the responses for that to help us to assess how engaged people are feeling, where are we on our cultural journey, how are people feeling about simple, personal and fair, and what do we need to focus on in the coming months so that we keep refining our priorities over time. So just about how have we measured culture change. In summary, we've divided it into 3 areas. So the first is that we have some metrics that we really assess. Do people really feel informed and engaged in our purpose and our vision and that story? The second is around the cultural experience. What does it actually feel like to work here? Would they recommend working at Santander to others? And are people really truly living the values? And then the third one is around the cultural outcomes. And this is one that we're constantly working on this, around how do we measure the outputs in terms of our absence, our attrition, some of the hard engagement, the hard people metrics to make sure that we're going in the right direction. And ultimately, how is that impacting our customer metrics as well? So some analysis that we did that was really interesting was we looked, and I think you commented on this earlier on this morning, around looking at where we had our branches with the highest engagement. Actually, there was a complete correlation with those that had the highest customer satisfaction levels. And if you look at those metrics, then particularly if you're trying to have an internal discussion around the importance of this work, those kind of metrics really give you a great argument as to why it's important. We've developed a culture dashboard. It evolves all the time, actually, so it's not a set-in-stone dashboard. But I just wanted to highlight on here some of the things that we measure that potentially you could apply in your own organisations. We report this up to the board and take it to our executive committee several times a year. And in here we cluster together some of our survey questions to give us an index on cultural alignment and also on enablement. So what we have done with some of our metrics is we drilled in to see which are the questions that are most likely to have an impact on cultural alignment. For us, we found that was around leadership, it was around process simplification, and it was also about well-being. And then the other piece that we measure, which I talked at the very beginning, that we have our values of simple, personal and fair, and we use those internally and with our customers. So we measure customer response to simple, personal and fair, and also our employee response to simple, personal and fair. And what we found was that actually customers' perception was stronger than our own employee perception of those values, and particularly on something like simple, where a lot of our service and our product offering to customers has really been simplified, but actually some of our internal processes had not simplified in the same way. So our employees were the ones that were delivering simplicity, but were kind of a bit like a swan, sort of looking graceful on the surface, but actually moving very fast underneath. And that really helped us to identify where do we need to focus going forward. We need to be simplifying things for our colleagues as well. And then on the far side, we ask very specific questions about the behaviours. So going back to our colleagues told us this was important, so we have to keep measuring it. We've got to see how are we doing against all of those 9 behaviours. And that helps to identify where we've got opportunities for us to do more work. So for example, a really interesting area that we've been focusing on are the 2 behaviours of speak up and truly listen. So actually you've got to do the same. Those 2 work together. You can't have employees who are speaking up if nobody's listening. So when we go out and do communications to colleagues, we make sure that we talk about the 2 at the same time. In the end, it's all about outcomes for our customers and our employees. I appreciate this slide, actually, I'm sure you can't really read it, but on here, this is just an excerpt from our sustainability report that was published last week. And it talks about our achievements for our customers, ratings for our digital app, increases in mortgages for first-time buyers, how we're supporting startup businesses. So there's that focus, but also looking at how we are supporting communities, supporting our employees. My final slide is really just to summarise some of the things that I think have worked well for us at Santander with our culture journey. We're going through lots of change, and as I said at the beginning, that's only going to keep going. We've got so much change within financial services that we've got to keep on realigning, reviewing what our culture priorities are. It's really important to involve colleagues. I know I talked about that with our when I talked about the definition of the behaviours. We've actually recently launched a new vision within the organisation with our CEO, again going out and talking to colleagues about, where is financial services going next? There's so many new competitors, so many pressures in our sector, and we need to be telling a compelling story to our colleagues. And so involving colleagues is really important, and the leaders telling the story have got to be authentic. We are an organisation where we have colleagues all over the UK, and actually the leaders going out and talking to people personally makes a really big difference, where they can actually really see the whites of their eyes and can see that they truly mean it. And you get that from face-to-face interaction more than you can do with an intranet news story. And find some moments that really matter and make sure that you focus on them. So I talked about all of the things in that employee life cycle. Focusing on all of that is important, but you'll find you've got the big programs, but then you've got some of those smaller nudges that can make a really big difference. And finally, things change. If I look over the last 4 or 5 years, in our organisation, such a lot has changed, and we are constantly using the insights from our surveys to kind of regroup, look at what our priorities are, and then change our focus. And that's really what you've got to keep doing. Keep on changing, keep on adjusting your focus to make sure that you are continuing to evolve your culture. Okay, thank you.
Suzanne, we've had loads of questions for you. No, that's a good thing. Thank you so much for continuing to put in your questions. And by the way, I see some of you are starting to vote on each other's questions, which obviously we encourage you to do, so we can see those are the ones that you want asked most. 2 questions I'm going to sort of combine into one, really, is you talked about your roadshows that were about sort of listening rather than telling, but it strikes one questioner that not all leaders are particularly good at listening sometimes, and that was it a good test of leadership behaviours in itself? And I'll combine that with another question: was what happened to senior managers or directors who may have delivered strong commercials but didn't necessarily live the new values themselves? So what about leaders who know what they're supposed to be doing but maybe aren't necessarily living those behaviours themselves?
Yeah, I think in any organisation, you're going to have some leaders who find it easier to have those conversations with colleagues and to engage when they're talking about behaviours. Ultimately, if you've got leaders in the organisation who are not living them and not demonstrating them, it becomes very clear that they're not. And ultimately those individuals will need to go and work somewhere else. It's really difficult though, because if you've got, in a way that was what I was trying to emphasise as well. If you're not being authentic, if you're sitting in an organisation and seeing leaders that are demonstrating the opposite of what you're saying, you lose credibility. And that's where, ultimately the CEO has to make some difficult decisions if they're needed. Right. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the committee who meet with your CEO. How regularly do they meet? Ask one question, and is this just a platform for these individuals to provide feedback, or do they represent wider?
So the meetings every 6 weeks to 2 months. We sometimes, more recently, have combined it actually directly into our executive committee. So it was a kind of subset of ExCo, and actually it was the opportunity for you had senior leaders there, but it was actually for people leading the different initiatives to come and report on how they were getting on and to get that senior sponsorship. Because delivering a lot of this stuff is hard, particularly when you've got a lot else going on in the business. Sometimes this might not be, so I'm pointing at it like it's still there, these programmes may not be every other business leader's top priority. So the senior sponsorship was important to make sure that other leaders didn't think this was something that was, a bit fluffy and a bit nice on the outside, but it was actually at the heart of what was important to the CEO.
Yeah. What about situations, one other great question that we've had in situations where the news might be unambiguously bad, for example, that if you're any employee who transfers as part of a merger, or the movement to a new employer maybe wasn't what they originally applied for, and instead it came in when those sorts of disruptive changes happen, where something a department's closed down and the news is unambiguously bad. I mean, what do you do in those sort of situations in terms of how you apply this simple, personal and fair in those situations where the news is clearly not good?
Yeah, right now in financial services there is a huge amount of change, and to get through that there are some exciting announcements and things that are, that are about investments, but there are also some really difficult messages. And so we're actually right in the middle of how do we get that right. And the approach that we're taking is actually to be honest. And at the moment in financial services, there is a lot of ambiguity. What the future holds isn't clear. And so our communication approach is to try to be honest about the fact that we may not know all the answers. But that, for some people, that's quite difficult to hear, because you kind of want clarity. You want to understand what the future holds, and sometimes we have to just be honest and say we don't know.
I should say, I'm really sorry we haven't got time for all of these questions. There's so many great questions. I mean, are you around at the break?
Yes, I'm around.
If you want to sort of come and ask you personally.
No, please do.
I'm going to indulge a slightly cheeky one, which was a person who said that they loved the story about the actors behaving badly.
Yes.
And was there not a risk that it might just incite
total
other
risk?
Bad behaviour?
Total risk. And that's the reason why I gave that story, because actually it was a couple of years ago that happened. Yeah. But we were quite nervous that there might be, a bit of a mutiny. Yes, and actually it was very interesting. I know we're short on time, but in there it was quite interesting how the different groups at that training session responded. So there were some who sort of ignored this person. There were some groups that actually really took the individual to task and sort of actually kind of spoke to them about their behaviour and tackled it. But that was all part of the learning journey, and it was very, very well facilitated. So we did kind of confess fairly early on then to people that there were actors there. But we were a bit nervous about how colleagues would react to that they'd been sort of, tricked a little bit. Yeah. But actually the end result of the feedback was, it was a bit of a light bulb moment of, wow, this is, actually let's just look at how we were tolerating that, and that wasn't okay.
Okay, well, we don't think there are any actors in the audience, just people asking great questions. So thank you very much, Suzanne, for your fantastic presentation.
No, thank you.